By the start of the 5th century, Rome ruled in the territory of modern England and Wales and had ruled for almost 400 years. They called this land Britannia after the island chain, and they governed the territory as an imperial province. After centuries of administration, Britannia developed into a prosperous region with urban centers and commercial connections to a broader regional and global trade network. In the centuries prior, the Romans had established 5 colonies: Londinium, Eboracum, Camlodunum, Nervia Glenensis, and Lindum. These colonias, as they were formerly called, started as Roman outposts in federated or conquered lands. A few hundred Roman veterans and their families, attendants, and slaves were given several hectares of land in the proximity of the colonia to use productively in an agricultural manner. The term colonia eventually became synonymous with the highest legal status a Roman city could have within the empire. After centuries of local stability, many of the British colonias became major urban centers. Londinium had as many as 30,000 inhabitants in a centrally planned city with clean running water, a working sewage system, and marketplaces full of goods from all over the empire's provinces and beyond. Corruption and crime were checked by Roman officials, at least nominally, and the local garrison would have done the same for invading armies. The other Roman cities of Britannia had comparable planning. After almost 4 centuries of living within imperial borders, many of the local pre-Roman Britons and their tribal communities had now been included in the institution of Rome through the granting of citizenship. This allowed the Britons to retain varying degrees of their autonomy and identity based on their region, as long as they contributed economically and militarily to the empire. The political stability, population growth, and increased and uninterrupted commerce created massive surplus wealth for both Romans and Britons, and the overall Romano-Briton syncretic culture flourished. Aside from the city garrisons, the Romans also created 2 additional series of fortifications to defend their presence on the island. Hadrian's Wall, and more temporarily the Antonine Wall, served as an 180-kilometer-long barrier of stone and guards to the northern Britons looking to raid and plunder the prosperous cities south of the wall. These Britons were known by many names, as they were decentralized and tribal. Caledonians and later Picts being some of the most popular before becoming Scots. These fortifications were accompanied by 2 institutional roles, the Comes Britanniarium and the lower Dux Britanniarium. The Dukes of Britain was headquartered at Eboracum and was charged with the security of the northern border. His main assets were the garrisons of Hadrian's Wall and Eboracum. These 15,000 or so men were limitanei, or frontier guards, recruited from the local population, soldiers more closely resembling the auxilia of earlier generations. Although wielding significant influence, this Dukes of Britannia obeyed the orders of the Comes of Britannia, who commanded the mobile field army made up of the more professional comitatenses soldiers. This position may have been more temporary depending on the status of war. The Notitia Dignitatum, a surviving Roman document, tells us that the Comes commanded no more than 6,000 troops, of which there were 6 units of cavalry and 3 units of infantry. In the last century, the Saxon shore forts were also built on both sides of the channel. On the English side, they were commanded by the Comes Letores Saxonici per Britannium, or the Count of the Saxon shore forts of Britain. They housed garrisons, ships, and crews all intended to deter and meet raids by Germanic sailors of the East. This did not prevent them from employing many Germanic sailors, however, Franks more closer to the heartland of Gaul, but also Frisians and Saxons closer to Germania. By 409, the region had experienced a sustained period of peace ensured by a bulwark of Roman defenses. However, Rome and its representatives had officially evacuated the island by the same year, and the imperial resources needed to fully man the defenses of Britannia were no longer there. That is not to say that the entire system of governance, which includes the roles, institutions, structures, and people that uphold them, suddenly collapsed. In the same way that it took centuries to create a stable and urban environment with its associated complexities, it would take an equally prolonged and unstable environment to alter the political situation of Britannia. The Roman fortifications were still strong, and the people of Britain were still motivated to preserve their lives, lands, and families. And so, in the place of Rome, stepped in local civic leaders, warlords, and the remnants of other larger roles like dukes and counts. Among this new class of British leaders was a man who I will call Vortigern, as that's what the English call him today, although he was called Vortigernus by the Latin speakers and possibly something entirely different by the more native Britons of his era. When the 6th century historian Gildas introduces us to Vortigern, he describes him as usurper of the Britons, although I have seen the descriptor of tyrant as well. Little is certain about Vortigern other than that he was the leader of the Britons, at least in the proximity of London, and he had the title of king. One day, 3 ships described as quillae landed on the shores of Vortigern's Britain. The men that disembarked the craft were described as tall and fair. They came from the Germanic coasts of continental Europe, as far north as the peninsula of Jutland, and the crafts that carried them were ancestor ships of the famous Viking longboat. This is when we're introduced to the Jute brothers Hengist and Horsa. Far back on their father's side, the brothers claimed descent from the kingly god Woden, and they led the first band of Germanic migrants to Britain in this new era. Despite their legendary background, the brothers and their crews may have been forced to migrate due to overpopulation, with the men being the lucky selected at random. Vortigern treated with the brothers, and according to Gildas, together with all of the counselors, the proud usurper invited the fierce and impious Saxons. We don't know what invited means, but the Briton Nennius tells us that Vortigern would grant the Jutes land and possessions in exchange for their military service against the Picts on the northern border. The land given to the Germanic tribesmen was the Isle of Thanet, which during this era more closely resembled an actual island due to the presence of a now extinct 600-meter wide channel. Sources are once again obscure and inconsistent about the following events, often mixing in elements of drama and religion. I will try to recount what, in my opinion, is the most probable series of events that happened following the initial agreement between Vortigern and the Jutes, and why Vortigern acted the way he did. Although Vortigern's move to allow the settlement of Thanet by the Germanic groups was obviously risky and disfavorable to his Romano-Britannic base, it is not outside of reason. Romans had settled migrating tribes within their territory in exchange for military service previously, and it is possible that without the empire's resources, Vortigern simply did not have the means to fight constantly on opposite sides of the island against both the Germanic raiders coming on boats and the Celtic raiders coming from the hills. By allowing the Germanic brothers to serve as Federate allies against their northern enemies, Vortigern could at least sit back and watch as either one or both groups of foreigners took casualties in the ensuing battles, and his troops were spared. as long as the settlers were not allowed to reach a population size that could actually challenge local rule, the Romano Britons could exploit them as an asset. This is all assuming Vortigern was a strategist trying to help his country and not a tyrant, as Gildas claims. Initially, the Germanic federates of Vortigern seem to have held up their end of the bargain wonderfully, driving the Picts away from the northern border, often without the participation of Vortigern's troops. In the meantime, Germanic raids on Britain paused. If Vortigern's plan was to advance the interests of his own people, he had succeeded. The brothers were limited yet useful enough to drive off the Pictish pressure from the north. Not only did this pause two threats simultaneously, but it gave Vortigern enough time to consolidate his own power. Things could not have worked out better for Vortigern. Meanwhile, the Germanic colony had just reached a critical point. As many as 19 more ships had answered the brothers' call, and the financial upkeep of the warriors rose to an untenable level. The newcomers also needed more space. They were, however, not numerous enough to force the issue. All Vortigern needed to do now was terminate his agreement with the Germanic migrants and use force if necessary. This is when Hengist and Vortigern entreated each other again. This time, Vortigern had no more use for the warrior and wanted him and his people gone before they could grow any further. Hengist, meanwhile, still needed to find a new home for his tribe, so he ordered his daughter, Ravenna, to plow Vortigern and his men with fine wine and ale throughout the feast. By the end of the negotiations, instead of limiting the settlers or forcing them out, Vortigern had not only allowed them to stay, but also gave them all of Kent in exchange for marriage to Ravenna. He didn't even inform the ruler of Kent. Vortigern had officially betrayed his people. The Britons around Vortigern must have been in a complete panic at this point. Not only were they betrayed by their own king, but he was in cahoots with the enemy. There was one young leader of men who refused to watch his country burn down with the blessing of its king. This was the king's son himself, Vortimer. The Britons and their new king rose up against the traitor and his Saxons. However, time had passed since Vortigern's marriage to Ravenna. 10 more ships had landed on the Saxon colony, which was no longer limited to the Isle of Thanet, but had now entered the mainland. Some of the islands around Hengist's homeland were now even completely void of people due to the massive migration. Because of Vortigern, the balance of power between Briton and Saxon was a lot closer than before. Nennius tells us that Vortimer prepared his men and marched south. Anything short of total victory would be a failure. In order to undo all of his father's mistakes, Vortimer would need to deliver in an epic fashion. 4 battles were fought, and thousands died on both sides, which is saying a lot because only thousands participated. Both sides had moments of victory and defeat. When the Britons clashed with the Germanic tribes for the 3rd time, Vortimer's brother, Vortigern, died, but so did the brother Horsa. We know the Britons took the day because the next battle was fought much closer to the Isle of Thanet, near the stone on the shore of the Gallic Sea, according to Nennius. At the cost of great life, Vortimer pushed the tribes all the way back to their original colony on the Isle of Thanet and off the British mainland. On the Isle of Thanet, Germanic tribes lamented not only the death of their young warriors, but the loss of their new home. Although they still had the island, they needed more if they were to survive as a people. Britons liked their country. and as long as Vortimer and men of his quality defended it, invaders would simply have to look elsewhere.